Who is ultimately responsible for the actions of drunk drivers? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. I virtually have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to drunk drivers. I don't appreciate the choices that they've made that lead to this decision. I do think that they have a certain responsibility when it comes to avoiding that. And I think ultimately it's their decisions that lead to these disastrous crashes and whatnot that we see constantly in the media. Today, though, that assumption that I put forward is coming into question. A passenger who was with a drunk driver during a joyride that led to the death of the driver is trying to cast blame away from themselves and onto what I would regard as a third party. So the CBC reports that two parents are being sued over hosting a high school party for their child. Nearly a decade ago, these parents here, who are now being sued, organized a birthday party for their high school daughters. Two guests, one of which is filing this lawsuit, were involved in a deadly crash on their way home. The survivor of the crash, he was in the passenger seat, he was 17 at the time of the incident. The driver, who unfortunately passed away, was 18. The survivor is now 24, and as mentioned, is launching this lawsuit against the family, trying to incite blame on their behalf. He's claiming that the parents were negligent and ultimately that's what led to the accident. To me, that's just ridiculous, and the evidence will spell itself out for you as you progress through the story. He says, the passenger, that the adults there should have better supervised the party and done more to ensure everyone made it home safely. The parents say that they were home during the party and they did in fact have strict rules in place. Their chief rule was no drinking and driving, and right now each party here is simply playing their cards. They're saying what they think happened. Nothing has been confirmed though when it comes to this hearsay. Keep in mind too how long ago this was, nearly a decade ago. People's memories often fail them. You probably can't even remember what you had for lunch 5 days ago. So these guys are straining themselves to come up with this information. It's one reason why eyewitness testimony isn't highly regarded in the court of law. Believe it or not, human memory is easily manipulable, and it's not that accurate. You may think you remember something that never happened, you may miss certain key details, and overall, we just can't trust it. We do know the facts, though, about the accident that happened that night. So, the party in question held roughly 30 to 40 people. The parents did not provide alcohol to the high schoolers there, but they gave a 2-liter bottle of cider to their daughters. At the same time, we shouldn't play coy here. Nobody is that oblivious. They knew that these students would bring their own drinks. That's what happens at high school parties. They were fully aware that these guys were going to get sloshed. That's how things go. And we should probably clear up right now alcohol laws before we go on. This case occurred in BC. The legal drinking age is 19, and anyone under that is considered a minor. It is illegal for adults to give alcohol to minors, but that didn't happen in this particular case, and they didn't give it to any minors aside from their daughters, and that's actually okay. A minor can be given alcohol by their parents in their own residence, which is supposedly what happened here. When it comes to the strict alcohol laws about distribution and consumption, there isn't much to complain about. So, the gray area though, is what do you do when underage kids bring their own drinks into your house? The law isn't clear about the proper procedure here. Do you just let it happen? Are you responsible for that? Or do you try to confiscate it? Do you kick them out? How does that play out? It's very complicated because, as you know, hosting a party for your daughters, you don't want to be the parent who is too uptight. There are social pressures that play into this here, and that's why the laws haven't codified what exactly the proper procedure is. Do you try to fight the kids? They're not going to willingly give you their bottle of alcohol. Do you try to physically take it? Do you kick them out? Do you cause a scene? Or do you let it happen because it's not your responsibility? I'm not too sure what the right answer really is here, but the mother in the case stated what she thought. She said that she was okay with the underage drinking because she believed that the kids there were all responsible, they were all good, and whatever. So she was okay with it, and that's not really where the lawsuit is heading. The passenger is saying that these guys were just overall negligent. All the actions that they took cumulatively that night led to them going out and getting into that accident, and now we get to the two boys who played a role in that fatal crash. They were drunk and stoned out of their mind. This was due to their own volition, I should note. Nobody forced them into this state of mind, aside from the obvious effects of peer pressure. They then leave the party after they've been adequately hammered, and they stumble upon an unlocked vehicle just lying there in a nearby house. So they left the party, they walked a little bit, they found this car. It was for sale, and the keys were left inside. This is one of those situations that strikes you as being heavily unfortunate. To come across this opportunity for mayhem along your way home as you're heavily impaired and you're just a high school student who is looking for mischief. That's something that I wish was avoided. I wish that car was locked. I wish the keys weren't left there. But somehow things played out like this, where they were presented with the opportunity to have some fun. The driver, at the same time, did not have a valid driver's license. He was drunk. He was also high. He decided to take the car for a joyride. That's a concoction of a bunch of negative decisions and choices right there. So, they go for their joyride, and a crash ensues that takes the driver's life and leaves the passenger, the one organizing the lawsuit, with severe traumatic brain injuries. Now, we get to the fundamental question here. Whose fault is this? The driver? The passenger? The parents? The rest of the party goers? This was obviously tragic, and it's quite depressing. This isn't an attack on the boys, but we have to be logical and address this issue with a process. To me, there is no doubt the onus lies on the driver and to a certain extent, the passenger. The guy who's orchestrated the lawsuit. Nobody compelled them to drink and smoke. Nobody forced them to hijack this car. Nobody made them drive it. He didn't even have a license. How can you think that's a good idea? At the same time, this isn't a child that we're talking about. He wasn't 12 years old. The driver was 18, the passenger was 17. For the passenger to come back down the road many years after and sue the parents for their blatant idiocy of their own creation is just bewildering to me. Take some damn responsibility for the mess you've created instead of trying to pass the buck. I have no tolerance for impaired driving, and not understanding how the driver is the one responsible here is beyond me. How can you come to that conclusion? It was the driver and the passenger who left the party and found this car laying there. It was them who took the keys and turned it on. It was them who drove the car and got into an accident, even though they knew the person did not have a driver's license. How is that then the parents' fault for hosting a party? Are they the gods in your life? Are they the ones pulling the strings here? Is it their fault for providing an environment for you to get drunk? If that's the case, then maybe we should start shutting down bars and clubs, because they do the exact same thing. The difference here, though, is that it matters what you do in that environment as the individual. When things go wrong in life, the easy way out is to blame somebody else, to try and absolve yourself from the guilt you feel. This boy, the passenger, likely thinks to himself, what could he have done to avert the disaster? That's pretty crushing. To know you were complacent due to a boneheaded decision in the death of a friend. That's traumatic. How do you get past that? Maybe one of the more effective ways is to convince yourself that it's just not your fault. It was somebody else's. I have no doubt that these guys didn't expect this outcome to occur. They just wanted to have fun. They were presumably dumb high school kids, but their choices had disastrous consequences. Note, I said their choices, not the choices of outside parties. To project these feelings of remorse onto the family is madness. It would be very different if the parents actively made the situation occur. If they provided drinks to these minors, if these kids didn't plan on drinking before and they show up and all these balls laying around and the parents are actively pouring shots for you, that's one thing. If the parents see you enter a car in their driveway knowing you're drunk and they still let you go, that's one thing. But you walked away. You found a car in a random neighbor's parking lot and drove it. There are different levels of responsibility here, and it seems to me, based on the facts of the case, that the parents don't hold a large degree of that duty. If they did something to influence you, and you can establish that they did things to make you drink when you otherwise did not plan on doing so. If they did things to actively sabotage you, that's one thing, but that's not the case here. It brings into question too, what precedent a guilty ruling would set. Are hosts of a party or whatever responsible for the behavior of their guests once they leave? So you leave while you're drunk and you start driving and you cause an accident. That's illegal, and these guys are trying to sue the parents somehow for causing that. How about leaving while drunk and raping somebody? Or robbing a store, killing someone, going home and slapping somebody, destroying public property? Whatever you have, these are all consequences of you being drunk presumably and having left a party. Do you go back and try to hold the host culpable? Does the legal system try to impart responsibility for the individual's action onto a third party? How about clubs and bars? I mentioned it already. Of course, you have the onus to make sure that your constituents don't leave behind the wheel. But these kids left on foot here. How about a bar? If someone does the same thing, would you try and sue the bar? How far can we extend this line of responsibility without losing sight of reason? Are the owners of the car responsible? They left it unlocked and the keys were there. Is the manufacturer of the car responsible? Are the alcohol companies responsible? We can go down this rabbit hole as far as we want. This reminds me also, to go off on a tangent, about a lawsuit in America that happened recently. I believe there was a mass shooter who used a particular type of gun, maybe a Remington brand one. You'd have to fact check that. So I know what happened though. People started a lawsuit against the gun manufacturer for the actions of the individual, saying something along the lines of, because you created this gun, it allowed this guy to go into these stores and wreak havoc. Is it the gun company's problem? Is it their moral responsibility to hold everyone who uses their product to a certain standard? Or is it the individual's responsibility to use the product responsibly, to use it for its intended use? The company said, we don't make these guns for mass shooters to go out and kill people. Our ideals are surrounded around things like self-defense and hunting and whatever the proper applications of a gun are for. I'm not pro-gun by any means, but that to me is the same level of ridiculousness. You're going to sue a company who did not create a product in a particular light, and you're going to try and take away guilt from the individual who used it that way? These kids here were drunk driving because of a boneheaded decision. That's on them. To try and take away some of that guilt and cast onto a third party is nonsense. This touches on that free will versus determinism discussion that we've had before. Who is in control here? Are you simply at the mercy of pre-existing conditions? Are you the effect that stems from these uncontrollable causes in your life? That's virtually the case the passenger is making. He's saying that I am absolved. Causes outside of my control led to this. I didn't choose it, therefore it's not my responsibility. I didn't choose to get into this accident. I'm going to put the blame on somebody else. And the reverse perspective, one of free will, states that yes, some of these things are out of your control. You didn't put the car there in that parking lot. You didn't leave it unlocked. Somebody else put the keys there. You didn't plan how your thinking would be affected by alcohol. You didn't make yourself to be so susceptible to bad ideas. You didn't make yourself whatever you want to give there as an example. These were given to you either through genetics or outside circumstance. What you do control though is how you play the cards you are dealt. To not make a safe plan to get home and stick to it, knowing that you were going to drink that night, that's on you. To drink to the point of losing your mental faculties, that's on you. To not muster up the strength to fight off temptation via that unlocked car, that's on you. The thing that determinists fail to realize is that you are your own cause in the sense. Effects ripple out of you. It's not just an external phenomenon, and you can control how these internal causes operate to some extent. You might say, oh, well, alcohol makes me rather susceptible to silly ideas. Well, that may be out of your control, but what you can control, something that you can affect from a cause from inside, is you planning how to deal with that. You're not simply left at the whims of destiny. Now, the purely fundamentalist free will people miss a fact as well. They say that, yeah, none of these conditions matter, everything is on you. The truth is that nobody authors themselves. We are all dealt a certain amount of cards, a certain quality of cards, and we have a hand. The reality is, though, is that we pick how to play those cards. A crappy hand can win, and a good hand can lose depending on how you work with it. To act as though your hand was played for you is just disingenuous. Now, back to the case. In terms of legality, to successfully win this battle as the passenger, they have to prove a few things. First, they have to ask, should the parents have known that these students were about to drive? The second factor is whether they should have been able to tell that the 18-year-olds were impaired. Third, whether what happened was ultimately reasonably foreseeable and thus reasonably preventable. Any good lawyer will mop the floor with these accusations. So first of all, should the parents have known that the kids were about to drive? That's obviously no. The driver didn't even have a license. How can you predict that somebody without a license would try and drive? Second, they left on foot. They found a car that was unlocked with the keys on the seat in a neighboring house. These things are not something you would expect as the host of a party. That's completely out of the blue. You'd have to be a mind reader to predict these things would happen. Now, the second condition, whether or not they should have been able to tell that the 18-year-olds were impaired, that's actually a yes. They should have been able to tell that. Presumably it's a high school party, people are going to be drinking, but this is irrelevant though. This clause is heavily tied to the first one. Should you have been able to tell that they were impaired? Well, yes, but it matters what they do while they are impaired. If they just go home via an Uber or take the bus or the parents pick them up, it doesn't really matter. But if they're going to go out and drive, that's when it becomes a consideration. So this point is heavily related to the first. When you debunk that, the second one fails as well. Now, the third point, which is very interesting, is whether what happened was ultimately foreseeable and reasonably preventable. The answer to that is no, because of the reasons we listed in the first part. How could you have predicted that these kids, one that didn't even have a driver's license, was about to go walk down the street, find a car with keys in the seat, and just take it for a joyride, and then lead to his untimely death? These things could not have been reasonably foreseen. There isn't any argument that the passenger can make to prove his points. It's a losing battle, and it leads me to believe it's just simply a mechanism of trying to get rid of the guilt that he probably feels. Keep in mind, it's very tragic. You have to add a layer of humanity to the situation. Being the passenger in a car in a situation that you likely didn't stop that led to the death of your friend. Living with that memory is going to be crushing. You're going to be trying to deal with that in whatever way that you see fit. But when it comes to the law, we have to apply logic here to set a proper precedent to make sure that things are not improperly incentivized or disincentivized for. If drunk drivers are legitimately able to pass the responsibility onto third parties for the actions that they so obviously took, what does that say about our society? What does that say about individualism and responsibility that we are placing on everyone? It simply says that you can pass the buck. That's terrible. And then we have to ask ourselves too, what would something like that do? Well, first of all, people wouldn't throw parties anymore because they're so risky. They can destroy your lives because someone does something stupid after they leave. And it calls into question two industries like bars and nightclubs. And I don't particularly love these things, but I don't think they should be unjustly penalized for the consequences of someone else's choices after that they have left your establishment. Of course, you take precautions. If you see someone who is drunk and trying to get into a car, you stop them. But when somebody leaves who didn't drive there, who finds an abandoned car and doesn't have a license and they do something, that's completely out of your realm of perception. How you try to hold somebody accountable for a situation like that doesn't make any sense to me. Now, this entire debacle is just tragic, and hopefully it ends soon. I believe the outcome is going to be the parents are not found guilty and the passenger loses. Maybe the passenger should pay the legal fees for the parents because it really is a ridiculous lawsuit, but we'll see how things progress. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram @PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.